awesome. And I can't wait to tuck into his 500-plus page book, which hopefully he'll sign for me. Anyway, we tend to think of the power of data in the context of our own marketing world, right? But data is finding its way pretty much into every corner of our lives. Nate Silver knows all about the way data is changing our world. Nate first gained attention during the 2008 presidential election, where he correctly predicted the results of the primaries and presidential winners in 49 states. Presidential winner in 49 states. Today, Nate runs, that's pretty impressive. Let's give him a hand for that, right? Today, Nate runs the award-winning website 538.com. If you haven't gone there, you really need to do that. It's now published in partnership with ESPN and delivers data-driven forecasts and commentary on politics, sports, current events, pretty much anything you can measure. And I think that is pretty darn cool that there's a website that's all about statistics. Nate's ability to bring clarity to complex subjects has made him the public face of statistical analysis and political forecasting. His new book, The Signal and the Noise, Why Most Predictions Fail, but Some Don't, is a New York Times bestseller and a must-read. Database predictions underpin a growing sector of critical fields, right from political polling and hurricane watches, the stock market, the war on terror. But I just have to stop here and say, wait, direct marketers have been successfully using data and analytics for decades, because I know 3 decades ago I was doing that. So we've been doing this, but the best part is the rest of the world, they're finally starting to catch up with us, right? We're at the forefront of that in a very successful way, and that's why we are the data-driven community we are. Nate's perspective on data-driven world is especially relevant to all of us. He asks a fundamental question: what kind of predictions can we trust? Well, let's find out now. Please join me in welcoming Nate Silver.
How are you? Well, hello everyone. Can you hear? Oh, it's quite loud actually, so I'm not going to ask that rhetorical question. But thank you very much for having me today and for that warm introduction. I lived in Chicago for 13 years out of college, went to the University of Chicago, so it's always good to be home here. But I want to talk to you today and have a relatively brief interval of time about both the promise and the pitfalls of big data. Sometimes I was, for example, on a book tour in Italy recently, and the Italian periodical had some image of me with like a crystal ball and like a wizard's hat on, and it's like said, I'm not going to try and say it in Italian, but like the magician of numbers. And this perspective, I think, is actually quite wrong in some ways. It's not magic, it's science. It's a complicated science that we're still developing, but I want to explain to you some attitudes and practices that we can adopt to increase our chances of success. So as I was implying before, you might sometimes get the impression if you read kind of trade periodicals, if you pick up, say, the Harvard Business Review or Business Week, things of that nature. Big data is a very hot concept right now, and the idea is you see the advertisement, maybe it's a good advertisement that you hire this company who works with data and they press a few buttons on their laptop or their supercomputer, and lo and behold, you solve all your business's problems all of a sudden, just like being statistical. Of course, it's rarely that easy in practice. The other version of this theory, as you see in the slide here, was this was written in 2008 by Chris Anderson, who was then the head of Wired magazine. And his proposal is that the end of theory, quote, the data deluge makes the scientific method obsolete. So his idea is that once you have enough volume of information, once you have millions or billions or trillions of observations, then the truth is kind of self-evident in the data. You don't really need any science, you don't really need any of you guys, frankly, if you have powerful enough computers and you guys become redundant. But fortunately, I think this conclusion is quite wrong and perhaps even a little dangerous. We do need best practices, we do need science, we do need theory. And you can look at this in part by some of the problems we've had as a civilization over the past decade or so in the so-called era of big data. Usually when you have a technology that's working well and improving civilization, improving business, then you see a lot of tangible benefits. But instead we've had a lot of problems as a country, as an economy in recent years. You see, for example, at the very time this article was written, in the summer of 2008, the entire global financial system was in the midst of melting down. And models in finance are very quantitative and data-driven most of the time, at least. But in this case, for example, with the housing crisis, a few flawed assumptions and you have what we call a garbage in, garbage out problem. You have faulty assumptions and you put lots of inputs in that machine, it comes out and just fools a lot of investors into buying mortgage-backed securities that are extremely risky and would all be downgraded or default instead. And likewise, if you read my book, these all represent slices of different chapters of my book. For example, the earthquake that hit in Japan in 2011, the tragic earthquake there. There were some seismologists there, some earthquake scientists, who wrongly concluded that an earthquake of that size, of magnitude 9.0, was impossible in that part of Japan until one actually occurred. So as a result, the Fukushima nuclear reactor only built to withstand magnitude 8.6. Instead, when you have a 9.0, you worsen the scale of the disaster. So I'm going to talk about, in relatively general terms, again, these are not so much technical things really as attitudinal things, about why we sometimes go astray despite having an abundance of data and what we can do to make things a little bit better. Skip that for now. Let me start a little bit though by talking about my experience with the election campaign last year in 2012, where we have a forecast model where it uses mostly polling data, some economic data. It's a rigorous model, it's disciplined, so you apply the same program every day, but in a way we think is put together very thoughtfully. And on election day last year, that model correctly called 50 out of 50 states right. But really as compared to a lot of the problems that you guys are facing, that society is facing, this was a pretty simple approach. You can basically break it down into 3 steps. The first step is you're taking an average of the polls. For the most part, when you have an abundance of data, one problem you have is that people are looking, they're very attracted by the outliers. If you had, for example, 20 polls in a row showing Barack Obama ahead in Minnesota. The 21st poll comes out, it has Mitt Romney ahead instead. Well, to a first approximation, you should probably ignore that data point, unless there's some cause behind it. But instead, you read the media, and that poll gets all the hype instead. It might make for a good narrative, but the problem during election campaigns, a lot of the time, not all that much changes from day to day, but of course you have to fill lots and lots of space on cable television, you have to fill lots of column inches in the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, and so forth. So making something out of nothing, out of random noise, is a big issue. But basically just looking for the long-term trend, the consensus, is all that we're doing conceptually. The second idea, as I said, is looking what I call count to 270, meaning we have an electoral college system in the United States. So what permutations and combinations of states get the candidate a winning map? All those games if you are an election nerd, filling in the blue and red states. Which of those combinations work and help a candidate win the White House? It's useful to think a little bit about how states are correlated with one another. So, for example, states like North Carolina and Virginia, similar demographically, might move in the same direction, whereas different states like Colorado and New Mexico, different part of the country, might go in another direction instead. But again, some art, some science in the execution, but in principle, nothing that complex. And lastly is what I call accounting for the margin of error, meaning that there's uncertainty in the forecast, not so much on election morning, but a lot when you're going very far out in time and space. So we get credit for having called all 50 states right. If you read the fine print of the slide, you'll see we're actually thinking in terms of probabilities instead. It's a forecast in the same way that a weather forecast is probabilistic. So not too hard to know, for example, that Mitt Romney was going to win Alabama or Utah, or Barack Obama would win Illinois or Massachusetts. But Florida was basically 50-50. We had Obama with a 50.2% chance of winning. The problem is sometimes you provide the information to be specific, but people out there are not always good when it comes to interpreting probability in a rational way. If you say something has an 80% likelihood of occurring, that means people say it means it's absolutely certain. It's like, no, 80%. You know, if you're playing Russian roulette, you have an 83% chance of not being killed. Still not a very smart thing to do for the most part. But anyway, we are, working with data is as much about specifying what you don't know with big complex problems as what you do know, and that's embodied in these election forecasts. Still, despite that relatively simple approach, this generated a huge amount of attention and controversy, both positive and negative. I think it cuts against the grain of the instincts of a lot of political coverage. You also see the benefit of going on in the slide, going on the Colbert Report and the Daily Show, where for 2 days, with Google search traffic, I became more searched for in the US than the vice president. But to ensure you that Americans kept things in perspective, if you put Justin Bieber on the same axis, even on election day, the Biebs was searched for 10 times more than the vice president of the United States. So TV makes you famous. So there is, by the way, there are studies saying that the more often that television pundits go on TV, the worse their forecasts and their advice tends to be. So television is a dangerous thing, of course. But why politics? Why is this so controversial? Again, partly goes against the media's typical way of covering the story, but also people are now used to owning their own little bubbles of political information, where, for example, on MSNBC on a typical evening, only about 1% of those audience are Democrats. On Fox News, only about 5%, only about 1% of the MSNBC audience are Republicans. Only about 5% of the Fox News audience are Democrats on a typical airing of the Sean Hannity show, for example. So it's not just a matter of Republicans and Democrats disagreeing on the facts. They actually get 2 or more entirely different sets of facts, or facts, depending on which network you might be watching. People are existing in all types of little bubbles, filtering in the information they get, and that makes it very, very hard for them to reach a consensus instead. So in that sense, having more information produces more possibilities of bias in different ways. Here's just one example, a site called the Drudge Report, conservative-leaning site, and what I've done here is to highlight in blue every poll he cites that has Obama ahead, in red every poll, every clip he has that implies Romney's going to win instead. So this is their homepage from election morning last year, at a time when, never mind taking an average, if you were just counting the polls, just put a frequency count, Obama ahead, put it in the blue pile, Romney ahead, put it in the red pile, do this for the key states, you'd have a much bigger blue pile, probably outweighing the red pile 6-1. But this is what you get on this website instead, where it's almost all good news for Romney, just a couple of token polls cited for Obama instead. So almost the exact opposite ratio of just what a simple count would give you. The good thing about elections, which isn't always true in politics, is that you do have a reality check. You have people vote, you see if your prediction matches reality, and if you were reading a website like this and relying on this website, you would learn in a hurry that that isn't always the case. That usually you're biased, you might tell yourself a story that you want to hear, give yourself a happy ending, but it's going to come crashing down to reality sooner or later. I think it's useful, especially given the current situation with the government shutdown and so forth, to critique our domestic politics. But even people working in good faith with data encounter different types of problems that are actually worsened in some ways by data sets becoming larger. One reason why is that as you increase the volume of data, the number of relationships increases at an exponential rate. The complexity of the problem increases quite quickly. And remember, statistics aren't for their own sake. A statistic like, for example, the Cubs haven't won a World Series, and what is it now? It's 97 years, I think, right? That's an interesting statistic, but we're really looking for relationships in the data instead. So, for example, if you have 5 variables, there are 10 different two-way relationships you might test. If you double the number of data, you have now 45 variables instead, and you see how this scales up very quickly. So for example, when the government's not shut down, you have a very useful website called Fred, where they track 148,000 statistics in real time, US international economic statistics. So now all of a sudden, there are just 10.9 billion combinations of two-way relationships that you can look through. This is actually getting toward a big data type of problem, whereas looking at election polls are more in the medium size instead. So there are certainly real insights in this data, but there are also a lot of false alarms and false positives. One infamous one, for example, is that for many years there had been a correlation between which team won the Super Bowl and how well the stock market did in the next year. So when the NFC team, say the Bears are the NFC team, or the Lions or the Packers won the Super Bowl, you have a good year for the stock market. When an AFC team, say the Broncos, won instead, you'd have a down year. And then finally, in 2008, you had a very exciting Super Bowl, the New York Giants. The NFC team came back from behind, beat the New England Patriots. There was a great catch by David Tyree, I think it was. So it should have been a really good omen for the markets in 2008. A dramatic come from behind win, and instead you have the worst stock market collapse since 1929 instead. If you're betting on a correlation that you don't understand the causality behind, or which doesn't have theory behind it, then you're usually going to be on the losing side of that bet. You're going to be the sucker in that deal most of the time. And some of these correlations will be highly, quote-unquote, statistically significant, but when you have 10.9 billion lottery tickets to play with, you're going to actually have a few highly unlikely outcomes that occur by chance alone. It's just a reason to be cautious as you mine through all this data. And remember, our tendency as human beings is to see patterns whether or not there are any there. I live in New York, and every 3-game Yankees losing streak is like an existential crisis in the New York Post, when it's really just a lot of random noise often instead. People don't have a good intuitive sense for what randomness looks like. People think that randomness means 1-0, 1-1-0, just oscillating back and forth, when in fact, when you have very large data sets, you'll have some amazing, interesting, even beautiful patterns that are ultimately just random noise instead. You see it in the stock market, for example. What I've done here is to take 6 stock market charts. 4 of them are fake, 2 of them are real, just generated by flipping 1s and 0s, virtual coins on a computer, and it's very hard for most people to tell which is which. And they assume that the random ones are actually deeply meaningful instead. It might seem that if we human beings are so prone toward bias when evaluating complex data sets, when working with probability and statistics, then why not turn things over to the computers instead? And believe me, automation can be an extremely useful tool when you have good programming, when you know what tasks you want to accomplish. But there are also times where some of these claims are overblown. So I'll give you kind of a metaphor here. What this shows is a position from the 1997 match between IBM's supercomputer, Deep Blue, it's playing the black pieces, and the Russian grandmaster, probably the best chess player of all time, Garry Kasparov, human being, he is the white pieces instead. So I'm not a chess guy. I actually like poker and games where there's some element of randomness that you're trying to navigate. But if you do play chess, you might have a view on who's ahead here, Kasparov in white or Deep Blue in black. What's interesting though is that, I guess sort of just like in the political landscape, both people looking at the same information are convinced that they're ahead, looking at it in very different ways, of course. What Deep Blue tends to do is to break the position down into discrete components. You can assign a point value, for example, to each piece that you still have left on the board. Deep Blue is counting its pieces, says, well, I give myself 3 points for every knight and 5 points for every rook and so forth. And I have 30 points, and Kasparov has 29, so I'm ahead. I'm probably going to win. What's this guy doing? Kasparov has much less raw calculation power than Deep Blue. Of course, I simplified what Deep Blue did there. It's actually evaluating millions of chess moves per minute, and Kasparov would literally need his whole lifetime to go through that many brute force calculations. But here's the flip side, where our human intuition can help us. He's good at seeing relationships, good at understanding strategy, and what he sees in this position is this problem right here for Deep Blue, which is that the goal in chess is not actually to get more shiny objects. It's to checkmate your opponent before you get checkmated yourself first. And Deep Blue has lost sight of the big picture here, gotten too caught up in the data, and in fact Kasparov has 3 pawns moving toward Deep Blue's unprotected king, a queen and a bishop toward the same pressure point, so in fact Deep Blue is in deep shape in this position here. Kasparov would go on to win, but not before a final sort of twist in the match. So one good thing about computers and machines in general is that they don't get tired, they don't go on strike, they don't get fatigued. So Deep Blue in this position became very poor here. Kept fighting on, hoping for Kasparov to make some type of blunder. Instead, toward the very end of the match, Deep Blue made a move that Kasparov found very strange. It moved its rook from the square labeled d5 to the square labeled d1 instead, so accomplishes nothing, just kind of random seeming really, nothing offensively, nothing defensively, wastes a turn at a time when Deep Blue can't afford to really waste a turn, so what gives? And Kasparov would go on to win this game here. But chess players, after the matches, tend to go through and think carefully about how the match went, reanalyze positions. And when Kasparov did that, he became more and more bothered by this move that Deep Blue made here, because he didn't understand why it occurred. He was thinking it was something along the lines of, I'm Garry Kasparov, I'm the best chess player in the history of the world. I can think on my best days 15 moves ahead. And I don't understand why this happened, so he inferred that meant Deep Blue could think beyond him now. 16 or 17 moves ahead instead, and that Deep Blue was superior and that he had somehow just gotten lucky in game 1. Maybe Deep Blue had lulled him into a false sense of security. It turns out, though, that I talked to one of Deep Blue's programmers, a guy named Murray Campbell, who's still at IBM, in fact. And what he told me is that what looked at first like a random bug actually was just a bug in their software. Deep Blue, great programmer, be in the Computer Program Hall of Fame, first ballot inductee for sure, but thousands and thousands of lines of code. You get into an obscure position here, been put together very hurriedly to try and defeat Kasparov in '97 after losing to him a year earlier. So there are some bugs somewhere in there, and Deep Blue had a fail-safe. If you hit an endless loop in the code, instead of timing out and forfeiting automatically, instead after X period of time it would make a random legal chess move instead. And that's what this is. It's the fail-safe. It's a random legal move. It does keep the clock running. Deep Blue theoretically alive. It's actually one of the worst moves you could make by coincidence in this position here. But this bug was mistaken for a sign of profound genius instead by Kasparov, who was no slouch himself. So this is the problem. I call it feature or bug. You have an insight from the data set. You have something which tells you that, for example, you have competition which is doing something in the wrong way. You have a new product that has the opportunity to sell really well. So this is a moment where you can have exhilaration, but it can also be terrifying. You have to. This is when you kind of the rubber meets the road as far as your experience and your skills in determining is this a feature or a bug instead. So one more example here. I live in Manhattan at roughly 30th Street and 7th Avenue. So Manhattan should be pretty easy to navigate, at least in terms of the logistics of mapping it out. It's all a grid. All the streets are numbered in order. It shouldn't be that tough. And this is, for example, how you would go from my apartment to the Guggenheim on, I think, 89th and 5th, where I was giving a presentation a couple of months ago. So that's the right way to do it. And this is the route that my taxi driver took instead that afternoon. So we take 3 paths back and forth through Central Park, do a loop-de-loop at 68th Street, and finally get there 40 minutes late. So I know that taxi drivers have a bad reputation in New York, a little bit better than the ones in Boston, for instance. But this guy was actually a nice fellow who was following his GPS very, very carefully. This is the exact route the GPS recommended to him. And I went back and tried to figure out why. And the reason is that there's a road that cuts north to south through Central Park called East Drive. It's kind of a twisty road, a nice road where they film a lot of commercials and like Law and Order episodes and so forth. But the GPS was really intrigued by this route because there was no traffic on it that day. Of course, there was no traffic because it was closed for repairs that day instead. So what it thought was a feature it was exploiting in the data set, saying, well, all these foolish people, why aren't they taking East Drive? not quite a bug, but instead a case of what you would call adverse selection instead. You're taking the leftover that everyone else is rejecting for a very good reason and recommending action based upon it instead. This can be a big problem in working with complex data sets when you don't have theory to override it. What should have happened here, by the way, is that this is where the cabbie's common sense should have kicked in. You basically never want to, for example, traverse Central Park more than once on the same journey, unless you see Godzilla on the Chrysler Building. But this guy was, I think, too trusting of his technology, I suppose. And again, I'm not a pessimist by any means at all, just a realist, and I feel the need to counterbalance some of the hype with some discussion of best practices. So what you see here is a neon sign depicting Bayes' theorem. You don't need to memorize the formula, there's no homework later on. But Bayes' theorem is just a centuries-old mathematical formula which tells you how you should weigh new information against what you already knew before. The essential idea being just that information needs context to become valuable to people. It's not statistics for statistics' sake. And you start with certain beliefs about what the world looks like and then update them and improve them as you move forward. So let me give you a few more applications of this. These are three ideas I have toward the end of my book. The three kind of bumper sticker slogans, so to speak. I think I couldn't actually sell very many bumper stickers saying think probabilistically, but these are three of the important takeaways, and I'll explain each one of them to you briefly here. So imagine that this is not a PowerPoint slide, but instead a beautiful river in North Dakota. It gets cold up in North Dakota, of course, every winter. In the spring, what happens is that the snowfall begins to melt, creates a lot of liquid, and that water flows into the streams and the rivers and creates the risk of flooding there every year. So in 1997, the National Weather Service predicted that you would have the flood waters of the Red River cresting at 49 feet in Grand Forks, North Dakota, one of the highest levels in years. But the people there had levees that would protect them up to 51 feet instead. So people were a little worried, but almost still bought insurance. After all, the Weather Service predicted 49 feet. 51 is bigger than 49, and because they're not public ones, they can actually do math, and 51 greater than 49, so they think they're going to be safe. But what Weather Service didn't tell people in North Dakota is that the margin of error on their forecast was plus or minus 9 feet, based on how accurate the forecasts had been in the past. They were worried that if they conveyed uncertainty in the outlook, that people would have less trust of the forecast. And believe me, this is a problem in all types of disciplines. I said before, why do people on TV actually make worse forecasts, people who don't go on TV? It's because on TV, certainty sells. You don't want to admit any doubt in your hypothesis, especially in politics, where in the real world, the scientific world, scientists are full of doubt, expressed in a very thoughtful way a lot of the time, but science is an iterative process. You go forward and back, you make marginal contributions, you get a couple of things wrong, you go back and forth and make gains over time. Politics is thought of as so winner-take-all, where people are afraid to admit any flaw in their method, and it actually means that the people you hear from most often are often the people who have the least to say. By the way, I don't mean to criticize the Weather Service or weather forecasters in general. In fact, especially since the 90s, they've become much better at conveying uncertainty in the outlook. Here, for example, is the path which they predicted for Hurricane Sandy late last year. So a couple things to notice. Number one is that you have a relatively intuitive visualization of the uncertainty here, where you go out in time, uncertainty expands, it's kind of a conic shape, so often portraying things visually is a way that clicks with people in a way that numbers or text alone doesn't. But also they've gotten a lot better at their forecast. So it's 4 or 5 days in advance of the storm, even then they predicted the exact landfall, the exact county rather, in New Jersey where Sandy would make landfall within 15 miles or so. This would probably not have been possible 20 or 30 years ago. It is a case where you have very good computing power, but also you have good theory. We know why the weather behaves as it does, the what part and how is somewhat more complicated, but we know the physics behind the weather. And weather forecasters are pretty humble. They're used to getting yelled at, they're used to being wrong, they put things in terms of probabilities. Actually, chaos theory, you may have heard, for example, sayings like a butterfly flaps its wings in Beijing and you have a tornado in Texas. That comes out of weather forecasting, and they learned early on that it's hard to be godlike and clairvoyant. You're not going to have a perfect forecast. Instead, you think in terms of shades or probability instead. And ironically, knowing what your limitations are actually helps you to achieve a lot more in weather forecasting and many other areas in which complex data sets are involved. Idea number 2 is kind of another metaphor here, what I call know where you're coming from. And what this shows is sort of a history lesson, but the path taken by the Japanese aircraft carrier task force before they attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii in 1941. This attack in 1941, which ushered us into World War II, was as surprising to Americans as September 11th would be 60 years later, despite it seeming quite obvious in retrospect. For one thing, we decided to stack almost our entire fleet in the Pacific in just one little harbor in Hawaii, Pearl Harbor, of course. Probably not a very sharp idea. But also we had reconnaissance only around certain naval stations in the Pacific. So Guam, Wicked Atoll, Midway Islands, Dutch Harbor, Alaska, and so forth. We didn't have global satellites back then. We were limited to these areas of surveillance. So of course, Japan goes exactly where we're not looking. If you've read Michael Lewis's book, The Blind Side, the same concept applies there, where you have a great quarterback, you have a great running back, and you have a left tackle who is faulty, the quarterback's going to get sacked, plays busted up in the backfield, you're going to go nowhere fast. And likewise, in lots of areas where you have intense competition, certainly in markets, certainly if you're ever competing against hackers or regulators or anything else where it's a cat and mouse game, you're often defined by your weakest link. So it's very important to know where you're coming from, meaning what are your biases, what are your preconceptions, what are your incentives, how are they affecting the way that you perceive the data. Again, lots of people, especially in politics, but I imagine also in marketing, are very skilled, whether they mean to or not, at manipulating data sets in ways that tells them a happy story instead of the real story a lot of the time. And finally, idea number 3 is try and error, just emphasizing the iterative nature of the process. I used to play poker, and if you look at how much different poker players win or lose, one thing you notice is that the worst players lose a lot more money than the best players make. It's a lot easier to be really, really bad at something than to be really good at something. But eventually you learn a few simple things. So in poker, for example, the basic notion of, well, you should probably fold your bad hands and bet with your good hands. Even something that simple probably gets you making the right decision a pretty high percentage of the time for very little effort. Some fields, again, I think like politics or perhaps like baseball in the pre-Moneyball era, weren't even getting those very basic things right. The problem is that in competitive industries, which is most industries in a capitalist system, everyone quickly catches up. They say, here's some free money lying on the ground, let me do the easy things, and so you have more robust competition instead. This water level, so to speak, begins to rise, and you have to be more and more creative, more and more innovative, and make gains around the margin. I think the thing that people don't get sometimes is that there's so much focus on miraculous results or great stories or big wins. If you're in a big data environment, then what it's really about is having a lot of little wins instead, making progress around the margin in a continuous way. If you look at what Google does, for example, Google is running thousands and thousands of experiments on their search products every year. It's never a static thing. Instead, they're doing A/B testing, they're making tweaks, rolling out new features, and they test them on real customers and pull the plug or revert back when things aren't working out. It's much easier to have an idea that looks great in a model or a PowerPoint than in reality. Sometimes, happily, the reverse is true as well, where something which seems like just kind of a random one-off idea winds up taking off and becoming the next Twitter or something instead. So if you have the opportunity to test ideas on real customers. I know this industry has this practice, so maybe preaching to the choir here, but testing ideas on real customers is always superior, almost always, to spending too much time in model land. Being in a big data environment and evolving and constantly refining your hypothesis. So again, just to recap here briefly, to kind of translate these not very saleable bumper sticker slogans into kind of more common English. Number one really means that know your limitations. Again, it's tough for us to admit them, but none of us are clairvoyant, and this isn't magic, so it's a matter of saying what you know and what you don't know. Number two, know where you're coming from. Consider your assumptions. We all do have assumptions. If you claim to have no assumptions, you get yourself in a very strange place indeed, but think about the lens through which you perceive the data and what your incentives are, what you want to get out of it. And number three, try and error means refine your process. One of the other lessons I learned in poker is that the best poker players are not very concerned, ironically, about their results. They're concerned about how well they play the hand. If you play a hand well and your opponent makes a flush, well, you should still be proud of yourself. If you play the hand like a donkey and you make the flush instead, then you shouldn't be too happy. It's more about process of continuous improvement, and people who really are nerdy about big data, I think, tend to get this. The battle is the fun part a lot of the time, and under Bayes' theorem, you start out with an idea, you refine and test that idea in the real world, and that output becomes your input again. It's always a matter of continuing the cycle. So I'll conclude with this thought here, which is a quote from Michael Babiak, who's a PhD at Duke, that speaks, I think, to why, despite all this great technology and great information we have, we sometimes struggle as a society to put it to good use. What he says is that in science, we seek to balance creativity and skepticism. And what we need is plenty of both. What you see a lot of the time is either people who are relying so heavily on gut feeling and not being data-driven at all, or people who are too resistant to change, people who are too technical and don't see the bigger picture. But if you have a mix of both these things, creativity on the one hand, skepticism on the other, both as individuals or as organizations, then you will find you'll be able to make an awful lot of progress. So thank you guys very much.